Okay, we're back, and we are here to talk about American Gothic literature, just in time for Halloween. Actually, a lot of the Halloween aesthetic and traditions that we all love so dearly really hail back to a lot of horror, the horror genre in terms of stories and movies and things like that, too. Really have a lot to thank the American Gothic literary movement for, and artistic movement as well. I've actually got a painting here on the first slide for y'all to give you kind of a sense of what the style, the aesthetic style would be for American Gothic. So you can probably see that there's like this, the color scheme is very kind of muted and dismal in a way, but in a way that's kind of beautiful. There's also this sense of decay and mystery and maybe things being potentially haunted. And there's just this kind of theme of like a once grand past that has crumbled into something that is beautiful in its own way, but in a very different way than the original, grandeur of the former place and time. So that's what Gothic aesthetic is really all about. So we're going to talk about some important themes. So common Gothic themes, and this is something that you're going to be definitely called on to talk about on the discussion board and possibly on the next test. So in Gothic literature, there's this concept of what's called the bipart soul, this idea that all humans have really two sides to us. There's our rational side, the side that can think logically and reason through things and trust science and understands that there's a reasonable explanation for everything that happens. And then there's that other side of us that still, as much as we may want to rationalize things, it's that side of us that you're home alone at night and you hear a sound unexpectedly somewhere in your house. And it's that deep down in your intellectual, rational mind that, okay, there's a reasonable explanation for that. But you're still, the other kind of irrational side of you is still pretty spooked and freaked out and thinking like, well, maybe there isn't. Maybe there is actually a ghost in my house or a serial killer or some other kind of like extremely unlikely thing, right? So that's something that we all experience to one degree or another. And the Gothic writers really like to capitalize on that bipart soul that we really all have, and those moments of where we're not sure which side of us is going to win out, right? They were also really into guilt, using that as a common theme that runs through a lot of the literature, something you're going to see a lot in Poe and in Hawthorne's work. This idea of like that the things that we do, the terrible things that we do, will haunt us. They will come back to get us one way or another, that you can't run away from the things that you've done, and to try is folly, because the guilt will eat you alive one way or another, or drive you to madness. They love that too. Okay, the uncanny. So you may have heard of the concept of the uncanny before. There's a concept of the uncanny valley, which is this thing that happens when you see something that is, as it says, strange but also familiar. So they usually use that to talk about AI, to talk about like robots disguised as people. If you've ever seen videos of programmers talking to robots, there's something kind of creepy about there's something very creepy about the robots, because they're similar enough to us but still strange, and there's just something you can't quite put your finger on that is disturbing about them. That's the uncanny. So obviously with Gothic lit, I mean, this is all happening way before the concept of AI had even been created, but it's still a theme that comes up a lot, this idea of and it actually comes up in Irving's story in Rip Van Winkle, right? When he wakes up and everything around him is both strange and familiar at the same time. The landscape has changed. He knows where he is, but the landscape has changed. He goes back to his little town, his village, and it's the same, but it's different, right? There's all these things that have changed since he took what he thought was just a short nap. And so that's a really good example and that's kind of like disturbing feeling of, okay, I know this, but I don't know this at the same time. Strangeness within the familiar. Abjection. So this can kind of go along with the guilt theme as well. Doesn't always, but it's this idea of something that is, it can either be socially or it could be physically wretched or disturbing or contemptible in some way, and this obsession with needing to cast out, drive out, isolate, possibly even humiliate this contemptible, wretched, disturbing person or thing or like aspect, or again, it could be something social, which comes up in Hawthorne's writing quite a bit, Poe's as well, because they're both Gothic writers. So hopefully you'll see some of these themes at work as you go. So one of the things I would have you look for as groups in a face-to-face class, and which is something you might have to talk about on a test, is I would have y'all find an example of each one of these Gothic themes somewhere in your assigned Edgar Allan Poe stories. And there's plenty of examples to go around. So you may want to take a moment to highlight a few of those in your textbook so that you can call upon them later, and it might come in handy for the discussion board as well. You never know. All right, more about American Gothicism. So just to kind of get behind, a little deeper and behind the themes, usually these themes beyond literature represent the author's thoughts and doubts about, we've got this democracy, and there's doubts about the ability of individuals to govern themselves in a full-fledged democracy. So the Gothic writers had a pretty dismal, pretty negative view of humans, generally speaking. So they had a lot of doubts about this. And they also believed that, again, this kind of idea of being haunted by the past, that neither the personal nor the cultural past is dead, and neither. And both can easily return to haunt us. And that can be done symbolically, or it can be done quite literally. Some other common characteristics. So the things that, y'all are probably pretty familiar with. Again, you get a lot of this influencing modern day horror as well, this atmosphere of mystery, of suspense. Secrets everywhere. Everyone's got so many secrets, and they're all lying within a supernaturally charged environment to be uncovered. So those secrets might have to do with the supernatural, or they might be secrets that the characters themselves are guarding, but it's all happening in this supernaturally charged environment. Oh my goodness. Some kind of ghostly legend, occurrences that cannot be explained through rational means. There might be a tale of horrible death or murder, something that doesn't necessarily happen in the story, but that kind of haunts everyone further on down the line. That'll be referenced. Omens. Also huge amounts of foreshadowing. I imagine you probably learned about foreshadowing in your English 102 class, but if not, just the name kind of tells you what you need to know. It's foreshadowing is never for good things. It's always for bad things, and it's just hints. It's symbolic clues kind of planted throughout the text that are heralding or hinting at some kind of terrible negative outcome for the protagonist, for the characters. So both Poe and Hawthorne's work is just absolutely lousy with foreshadowing. For instance, like in The Fall of the House of Usher, there are all kinds of hints, foreshadowing throughout the story of the terrifying and shocking ending that's to come. So please make sure you read that whole story through, because, it's totally worth it for the end. And the end is sort of confusing, I'll admit that, but it's kind of meant to be confusing. It's left open to interpretation, but yeah, it's pretty intense. So I hope you enjoy it. I'm a big Poe fan, so some people, he just really appeals to some people. I like Hawthorne too, but Poe's just a little more fun. Hawthorne's always got kind of a moral behind everything he writes, and Poe is a little bit just more creepy for creepy's sake, right? And dreams too. That's something that comes up in that same story, Fall of the House of Usher. All of these things play a large role. Some other common characteristics. We talked about the importance of emotion in Romanticism, and Gothic literature really took this and ran and ran with it. So just really highly charged emotional states that the story will be constantly building toward. There's always some kind of like moment of extreme emotional duress that happens in these stories. A feeling of terror, of a character going completely mad, or we're not even really sure if the character went mad or not. That happens too sometimes. Intense anger, feeling agitated. Again, throughout the story, this just like constant sense of impending doom, like something terrible is going to happen. And the characters, or the protagonist or narrator, can't quite put a finger on like what is this feeling and where is it coming from, but it's all kind of being osmosis from the environment around them. Not just grief, like the feeling of loss, but excessive grief that almost drives the character insane. Same thing with love. There's no regular love. It's like obsessive, possessive, desperate, excessive kind of love. Everything is like not healthy kind of feelings ever, and just totally overwhelming all the time for them. So, but on the same side, we get this kind of being eaten away by what's called ennui. It's just a fancy word for intense boredom. Just being a depression almost, but not really. It's just this sense of like, what's the point of anything? Just being weary, also physically or emotionally wasting away. That's something that comes up a lot as well. And that really had a lot to do with the time period too. This idea that a person could literally just waste away from being emotionally exhausted, or waste away from ennui, just the pointlessness of it all. Just yeah, these days we would try to find some kind of rational explanation for that, but not then. And of course, supernatural events, ghosts, people coming back from the dead, doors opening themselves, sounds that can't be explained. Again, follow the House of Usher, lots and lots of that going on. So, and also just the environment and everything it's a perfect story, perfect snapshot of all things Gothic themes. So pay attention, please. And then the settings are typically grand old houses that are kind of like falling apart, or maybe a cave of some kind, or in Hawthorne's case, the woods. For him, the woods were a setting where that's where leaving society, leaving civilization, and going off into the woods is really symbolic of opening oneself up to possession, almost of a demonic form, but also going out and like having to face who you are. It's almost like the allegory of Jesus going out into the wilderness and coming into his own that way, but like the negative version of that. And then very descriptive language, and almost always used to evoke this sense of deep foreboding, like terrible things are going to happen. Some important elements to keep an eye out for when reading a Gothic story. So we've talked about the settings. Settings are really, really important in Gothic tales. They always mean more than just what they are on the outside. So that's why I've got symbols and allegory at the center of this. So the character, the main character, other characters, and then of course the use of sensory description of the people, the places, the things, what's going on. A lot of intense sensory description about what the sounds, a lot of description of color, of texture, of grand, like unbelievable size of things. And at the center of all of that there's going to be some kind of symbolic meaning behind it. So keep an eye out for it. Oh, and there's the man himself. Okay, so another concept to talk about is the difference between terror and horror. I know they sound like the same thing, but they are actually not. So we're going to pause right there because this recording is almost out of time, and we'll pick it back up on the next one. Terror versus horror.